If you're a medical student, you know the heartbeat isn't just simply a heartbeat. It's a complex dance of pressure gradients, valve clicks, and volume shifts as well. So if you've ever wondered and looked at the pressure volume loop and felt as though you were reading some ancient hieroglyphics, this video is for you. So today we are stripping away the complexity. We are going to walk through the cardiac cycle step by step from the atrial clicks to isovolumetric relaxations so you can stop memorizing and start understanding how the pump actually works. So let's dive in. The cardiac cycle is divided into two main parts: the diastole, which is the filling plus relaxation phase, and the systole, which is the contraction and ejecting phase. So, a common pitfall is thinking that the heart is either on or off, while in reality, it's a sequence of four distinct mechanical events occurring. So, I want you to think that whatever happens on the right side of the heart, the same events occur on the left side of the heart as well. So, these events are ventricular filling, isovolumetric contraction, ventricular ejection, and isovolumetric relaxation. Take note, this model reflects what goes on in the ventricles. So now, we begin with the filling phase, the diastole. So the diastole starts with the atrioventricular valves. By that, I'm referring to the mitral valve and the tricuspid valve, respectively. So it starts with these valves opening up. What will this do? This will allow for blood using gravity dependence to fall down into the ventricles. So 80% of blood usually flows into the ventricles just by gravity and the pressure gradient. That is the difference between pressure in the atria and the ventricles, with that of the ventricles being less at this point. The remaining 20% of the blood is pushed down by atrial contraction. This is termed the atrial kick. So, as a clinical side note, in patients with atrial fibrillation, they lose this kick, which can lead to heart failure symptoms over time. So, at the end of this point, we've gotten to the end of diastole, the very end. So, this is where we measure the end diastolic volume. So this is the maximum amount of blood the ventricle holds just before systole begins, which is the squeezing phase. So think of it as preloading of the pump, utilizing the passive filling and the atrial kick. So now, the systolic phases. The systolic phase is split into the isovolumetric contraction and the ventricular ejection. So at this point, we know the ventricle is full because it has been preloaded by the diastolic phase, right? So the isovolumetric contraction stage, pressure rises sharply. The moment ventricular pressure exceeds atrial pressure, the atrioventricular valve slams shut. That's what forms the S1 sound, the lob sound we hear. Note the name, isovolumetric. Hence, volume does not change because all valves are closed. So no blood leaves the ventricles at that point. And thus there's just pressure building up in order to, I would say, blow open the doors at a later time. Hence, it is isovolumetric. So, as ventricular contraction continues against a closed cavity, here we're speaking about the ventricle. So, pressure eventually exceeds the pressure of the outflow tracts. As such, the semilunar valves fly open, blood rushes out, and this is the point where we measure the stroke volume as the difference between the end diastolic volume and the end systolic volume. So, once the ventricle finishes contracting in the ventricular ejection phase, pressure drops, and as soon as it falls below aortic pressure, the semilunar valves, which are the aortic and pulmonary valve, snap back shut, preventing further flow of blood out of the ventricles. So that's when you hear the auscultatory sounds, the S2, the second lob sound. So the closure of the semilunar valves typically signal the beginning of the isovolumetric relaxation phase. Again, all valves are closed, the pressure is what? Plummeting, but the volume stays the same until it's low enough to allow opening of the atrioventricular valves and restarts the filling process all over again, taking us back to the beginning of this entire process, which is the diastolic fillings phase again. So we've gone through the cycle of the ventricular filling, the isovolumetric contraction, the ventricular ejection, and the isovolumetric relaxation phase. So now let's visualize it all on the pressure volume loop diagram. So here we have the pressure volume loop. It's basically identical to all we've spoken about earlier. So on the y-axis, we have ventricular pressure, and on the x-axis, we have the ventricular volume. So think of this, as I said earlier, like a system isolating just the ventricle. We are going to speak about this in phases, the same way we've spoken about earlier. So the phase one, which is the ventricular filling, which is this indicated by this bottom line here. As we said earlier, the mitral valve opens, the blood flows from the atrium into the ventricle, and notice the volume increase significantly, but the pressure barely rises. You can see the line is still almost on a very straight line. This is because a healthy ventricle in a healthy human is compliant. It stretches easily to accommodate the increased filling. As such, pressures do not rapidly increase. At the end of this phase, the ventricles are completely filled up. Diastole has concluded, and the heart is in preparation for the next systolic cycle. The next phase is the phase of isovolumetric contraction, phase 2. It's represented by this vertical line here on the right side of this diagram. So during this period, the ventricle has already been completely filled up by the diastolic phase. The mitral valve snaps shut. This is where you hear the S1 sound, which is the closure of the mitral valve and the tricuspid valve together. So the myocardium of the ventricle begins to contract and squeeze. As such, pressure skyrockets, increase within the chamber. But because the aortic valve is closed during this time, the volume within the ventricular chamber does not change. That's the important part to note. The volume within the chamber does not increase because the aortic valve is closed. However, pressure constantly increases because of this myocardium that constantly keeps on contracting against the closed aorta. Hence, this phase is termed the phase of isovolumetric contraction. The next phase is the ventricular ejection phase, represented by this top curve we see here. So, at this point, the pressure finally exceeds the pressure of the aorta, which is around 80 millimeter mercury. As such, the valve suddenly pops open, then blood rushes out. Hence, the volume drops while the pressure initially peaks but then starts to fall. As you see, volume increases in this direction. However, the movement of our injection is going in the opposite direction. That just shows that the volume within the ventricular cavity at that point is decreasing. So at the end of this is the end of systole. The final phase is the phase of isovolumetric relaxation, phase 4. So at this point, the ventricles are done with ejecting the volume. You can see at the point right here where ejection started, ventricular volume was quite high. However, at the end of ejection, ventricular volume is quite low. Hence, the aortic valve closes. This is what you hear as the auscultatory sound, the S2. The ventricles relax, pressure drops, but since the mitral valve is still closed, the volume within the ventricle stays the same. As you can see on the x-axis, volume increases rightward. However, in this case, volume remains perpendicular to the x-axis. However, pressure decreases continuously. As you can see here, pressure increases upwards, but the pressure within the ventricle decreases in the opposite direction. To completely understand the loop, we will need to know the corners. The far right corner is the maximum fill of the ventricles. It is termed the end diastolic volume. This is the end of diastole. While the far left corner here is the leftover blood after a beat, termed the end systolic volume. This is the volume of blood that remains within the ventricle after a systolic cycle has occurred. While stroke volume spans the width of the loop, it is the difference between the end diastolic volume and the end systolic volume. In essence, stroke volume is the volume of blood that made it out of the heart after a normal systolic cycle. While going to the pressure volume loop, we'll notice that there are two players here, pressure and volume. So we must see how other factors affect the pressure and volume within the ventricular cavity. Factors such as preload, afterload, and inotropy. A change in any of these factors will reflect on the pressure volume loop either as an increase or decrease in either volume or pressure. I speak further on these cardiac output variables like preload and afterload in another video. So let's begin with preload. So preload is determined by the blood within the ventricular chamber at the end of diastole. So it is significantly affected by volume. Increasing preload by, let's say, giving IV fluids stretches the loop further to the right on the x-axis because more volume ends up in the ventricle at the end of diastole. So you feel the heart more, leading to what? A higher volume at the end of diastole, hence an increased end diastolic volume. And the reverse occurs when preload is decreased. The loop compresses on the x-axis because less volume ends up in the ventricles at the end of diastole. Hence, end diastolic volume is lower than normal. The next variable is going to be afterload. Increasing afterload, as in the case of aortic stenosis, the heart has to work harder just to open the aortic valve. So, because it is pushing against so much resistance, so much pressure has to be generated only to simply eject very little blood. It means more blood remains in the ventricle after systole. Hence, you can see that the end systolic volume ends up being higher than in a normal system. So, we all know the reverse occurs in the case of decreased afterload. The final variable we are going to speak of is inotropy. As in the case of administration of adrenaline or dobutamine, the heart squeezes or contracts more efficiently. As such, the left side of the loop shifts further, even further to the left. Most of the blood within the ventricle is ejected during systole, leading to a smaller end systolic volume with a very massive stroke volume as a result of the highly efficient contractions pumping out significant amount of blood, making the stroke volume as large as it is. So we've spent time learning all the physiology of the pressure volume loops. This is very high yield for your examinations. So we are going to learn how to apply this in real life situations about how pressure volume loops change in various valvular pathologies. Utilizing the principles we've learned, we begin with aortic stenosis. We can see, similar to what we've seen, aortic stenosis is due to there's increased pressure, there is increased afterload. As such, we know the ejection pressure is going to be very high. Significant forces are going to be required for ejection to occur. Hence, we see the shape of the volume loop here. We notice that stroke volume is significantly decreased because much of the energy has been spent trying to open the valve. And as well, we can see that what end diastolic volume doesn't necessarily change. However, end systolic volume is significantly elevated because what? More blood was left within the ventricle after contraction. Think of it logically. Less blood was able to be ejected, thus more was left behind within the ventricle after the systolic cycle. The next valvular pathology we are going to look at is the aortic regurgitation. In aortic regurgitation, blood rolls back the into the ventricle after systole due to the dysfunctional aortic valve. As such, this new blood joins up with the incoming preload into the ventricles from the atria, and this sums up to be a higher volume. As such, what the total preload before the next cycle of systole is higher than normal. Hence, we see the shape of the pressure volume loop here, with the end diastolic volume being higher than normal. However, as we know, a normal myocardium is very adaptable. As such, it adapts to this increased volume by stretching and then contracting, making making stroke volume to be increased because this higher volume needed to be pumped out eventually. Next is mitral stenosis. What happens in mitral stenosis? During, during mitral stenosis, the atria during diastole cannot pump blood through the mitral valves into the ventricle. This is because of what? The dysfunctional stenotic valve. As such, less volume ends up into the ventricle. What does this do? This reduces the preload. Reducing the preload means the end diastolic volume will be low. Hence, we have the shape we have of the pressure volume loop right here, with the end diastolic volume being less than in a normal functioning heart. Also, we see that the stroke volume is significantly decreased. It makes sense. With less preload, there should be less stroke volume. All right, let's pivot. If you're looking at a patient with mitral regurgitation, their pressure volume loop doesn't look like a neat box anymore. So in a healthy heart, we have these two perfectly vertical lines signifying the isovolumetric contraction and the isovolumetric relaxation. Isovolumetric means the volume does not change because all valves are shut tight. But in mitral regurgitation, the mitral valve to be specific, is leaky. And the moment the ventricle starts to squeeze, blood doesn't wait for the aortic valve to open. It immediately starts leaking backward into the low pressure left atrium due to the dysfunctional mitral valve. So because blood is leaving the ventricle from the very start of contraction, the volume is dropping while pressure is rising. The result is that what? The sharp bottom right corner here is gone. The line tilts inward immediately. The same thing happens during relaxation. The vertical lines effectively disappear because, as I said, valves are dysfunctional, allowing flow when it shouldn't. So now look at the width of the loop. It actually gets wider. On paper, it might look as though the heart is working very well and being very efficient because the stroke volume seems to be increased. But here's the clinical pitfall with that. The total stroke volume increase is a lie. It's technically split. Some goes forward into the body as forward stroke volume, but a huge chunk is flowing backward into the atrium. It's termed the regurgitant stroke volume. So the heart is technically working harder. The patient still feels dizzy and short of breath because their actual systemic output might be lower than normal. Because of what? The ventricular output is split between forward flow and retrograde flow. So now, why does this loop even shift the way it does? To the right side here, we see that what? The left atrium is generally getting double filled. It gets the normal blood from the lungs plus the leak from the ventricle. As thus, when the mitral valve eventually opens, all the extra volume dumps into the ventricle during diastole. This increases our end diastolic volume and pushing the right side of the loop further out. Now, to the left now, because the ventricle has an easy exit through the leaky valve into the low pressure atrium, it can empty itself even more completely, as I said earlier. This actually decreases the end systolic volume, shifting the left side of the loop even further to the left. So the takeaway that I want you to put into mind is that, okay, if you see a pressure volume loop that looks kind of lopsided, like this overstuffed pillow with no vertical sides, you're most likely looking at the pressure volume loop of mitral regurgitation. So thank you very much, guys, for listening in. We've gotten to the end of this discussion. If you found this useful, like and subscribe to the channel.